You're listening to Radio Robin Hood and our meeting today with the British poet Joelle Taylor in Poetry Café.
So let's say welcome.
Thank you.
Is this your first time you have visited Finland?
It is, yeah. It's so beautiful here. I've been really amazed by the people. I've been really, really friendly. Like just ordinary people on the streets have been really friendly and very kind and hospitable. And last night was fantastic.
Great. And let's talk about your poetry and when did you start writing poetry, when your journey started?
I started as a teenager. I was in a punk band. So I was playing a lot of very bad punk music and doing lyrics over the top. And then one fateful evening, we were so bad that the rest of the band walked off stage and just left me there with the microphone. So I thought, okay. And I just carried on doing the lyrics. And after that, I was offered a gig with a huge band at the time called the Pogues. And that's when it started, when I was about 15, 16 years old. And then I'm from the UK. And I just started performing all across the UK, wherever I could. And I've been doing it for like 25 years. So a lot of my work is in books, but it's also, I'm a spoken word artist, so most of the stuff is performed once only on a stage. So that was really its beginnings. I also write plays as well, and I've just finished a novel, which I'm hoping will be out next year. But we have to see, it's a very different world writing a novel.
Yeah, and how the environmental factors have contributed in creating you as a poet?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I come from quite a disadvantaged background in a sense, and my family moved continually from one place to another, so I was constantly the new person in town and the strange one. My voice was strange, the way I looked was weird, so I was constantly the outsider. And really, my background informs the politics of my poetry, so I'm most interested in finding beauty in the ugly places and to give a voice to those people who are like myself, who are silenced, overlooked and forgotten. So that's really the working class communities of the UK. And now I live in London, and for the last 16 years I've been working a lot with people who are in gangs, young gang members, as well as people we class as refugees or asylum seekers. I work with people from the Gypsy Roma traveller communities. So basically I try and focus on people who have been silenced by great trauma or by the circumstances of growing up, and try to give them a platform so that they can find their own voices.
Have you succeeded in giving them the platform?
Yes, I think I have. I know that sounds like really arrogant, but I set up the National Youth Slam Championships of the United Kingdom.
Okay, let's talk about that. And yeah, how, if you tell us, what about that and what's this organization?
So basically, slam in my country didn't become popular until the mid-2000s, and it was a kind of political motive, essentially, for me to set up a youth slam. And I did it just in London to begin with, and that was about 16 years ago. And we used to have to write to the papers and tell them what slam poetry was, because nobody understood it, or what was going on, and why the events were so raucous and loud, very, very loud. There's a lot of interactive audience participation in UK slam, so it's not, you don't sit there quietly go. It's lots of clicking and shouting and clapping all the way through the event, so it's about the dynamic between the performer and the audience. So I set that up really as an anti-racist initiative back in 2001, because there were a lot of racist attacks at that time in the UK. So that was the focus of the whole thing. We were all talking about our heritage and our identity as human beings, and really trying to get everybody's story into the mainstream, rather than it constantly being minorities who have been silenced within our general society. And it became very successful. So a lot of the UK artists who are very popular now, I worked with when they were kids, when they were like young teenagers, and I've mentored them, some of them for 10, 15 years. And our biggest artists are people like Anthony Anaxaguru or Kayo Chingonyi, Jay Bernard, and Krept and Conan, who are a huge, huge band, and I can't even remember them. But there's literally been thousands. And in 2008, it went from just being about London and spread nationwide. So suddenly we were getting stories from kids as far away as little desolate islands in the north of Scotland, down to Wales, the whole of England, London, everywhere we could. And try and... The idea is both to collect their voices, to create an archive of what people really think and their politics, but also to seed and nurture the next generation of poets and spoken word artists. And crucially, that they are not coming from the middle and upper classes, which in my country, most literature is written by these people who go to public schools, and they're very well educated. And so I thought, no, let's actually have some voices from the majority, the people on the streets. So it's very linked to hip-hop culture and grime MCing culture. But you can see now we even have a form which we call spoken word, and that came from slam. I was a performance poet before then. So the differences are became performance poetry, which became slam poetry, and now we have spoken word. So not very many people slam anymore. We don't compete in the same way anymore in my country.
More than anybody else, you have brought the slam poetry to UK.
Youth slam poetry. So I didn't...
Youth
slam poetry.
Yeah.
There was a guy called John Paul O'Neill who attended the early slams in America, and he came to the UK and started the first adult slams, which are still running now. But now there are lots of different adult slams that you can get involved in. But there is only one youth slam, not one national solo youth slam, and that's Slambassadors UK, which I run through the Poetry Society, which in itself is an act of cultural terrorism, because the Poetry Society represents people like T.S. Eliot, Auden, all the great poets, and it's very, very posh. It's a very posh place. It's very well-to-do, upper middle class. And so to bring in the streets into that environment was a revolutionary act within itself. And now, sort of 15, 16 years later, we're a part of the core programme of the work that the Poetry Society produces. And as such, it has entered the mainstream. For example, if you watch television now in the UK, adverts, there are spoken word artists on adverts. So instead of it just being, Tesco's, you'll have somebody doing a poem about it. It's becoming really, really popular. And also we're releasing albums and records, so we're becoming much more linked. It always has been linked with the music industry, but now it's becoming much stronger and clearer. So there are people like George the Poet, Kate Tempest, and they are huge artists, both in the UK and in America. I don't think they've really... Well, yeah, they've come here because I talked to someone about Kate Tempest last night. So that's really... It's making it a much more popular and populist kind of form. And it means that my aim was to generate, like I said, a new generation of spoken word artists that were coming from a more activist place. But now what we've got hundreds of clubs, spoken word clubs across the country, and there are so many high standard poets. It's incredible. It's really amazing. But it's scary as well, because we're like, oh my God, they're better than us. What are we going to do? So everybody raises their game.
Okay. With this refugee crisis,
yes,
and a lot of this big wave of refugee that have engulfed Europe, and of course, including most of there are many poets or writers.
Yes.
And especially they start to write in English in UK.
Yeah.
How do you welcome those to the cultural environment or to the poetry environment?
Well, I mean, the first thing is workshops. The very first thing. Mm-hmm. And I'm talking about like refugees age 14.
In which way that you held the workshop?
Well, recently I did a project in the southeast of England, which is closest to Calais, the jungle. And we managed to intercept a group of young refugees from Eritrea, from Syria, and from Vietnam. Mm-hmm. And they came and they attended a 3-day free workshop that I led, which was difficult because being English, I only speak English. We are the most stupid nation in the world. But it's been amazing because it's really challenged me to be able to try and communicate to someone who speaks another language and is also deeply traumatised. Mm-hmm. So that's one way of trying to do that. And from those workshops, I created, was it a man called Lem Sisse, a catalogue of poetry written about their experiences. And, you know, because in my country racism has risen again, the far right in the whole of Europe has really become horrific and very frightening and unprecedented since the 1930s and the rise of the Nazis. So we have a very right-wing government that will not allow people who are suffering into our country. Like, we had a huge row in the media because we wanted to allow 14 children into 14. I'm not talking about 14,000, 14 million, just 14 souls, 14. We haven't allowed it. And that's pure racism. It's pure racism. So we wanted to...
And how do you work together to defeat this racism?
Exactly, by focusing on people's humanity. So I know British people, and there's one thing that all British people respond to, and that is somebody in crisis and suffering, the underdog, we call it, the underdog. So I worked with this group and we created this spoken word and poetry. Some of it we recorded, some we put to music, and then I took those poems to a group of artists, visual artists, like a projectionist who does video mapping, it's incredible, and an incredible songwriter. And then working with the workers of art, these are the people that commissioned me to do this, workers of art in Canterbury. We took over a major theatre called the Marlow and created this space where ordinary British people, the most racist ones, can walk into this space and experience over the course of 20 minutes what these people went through to get to our country. So they'll hear. It's very difficult when you hear a young boy, aged 13 or 14, talking about walking alone across the Sahara Desert, having seen his friend shot and having to leave him to die because he, shot in the leg, so he was still alive, but he couldn't carry on, so he left him to die. And when you hear that story, you can't help but cry. You can't help but go, oh my God, because you imagine, what if it was my child? What if it was me? So that's one way we started to challenge it. And also, some of the younger refugees, up to 18 years old, are attending schools and colleges in the UK, those that have come through illegally. And so I've done a little bit of work with them as well. And I'm hoping, there's a young boy, he's 17 years old, and it was him who told me the story about walking from Eritrea to Calais, essentially. There's a boat as well, told me about falling into the ocean. It's awful. And we're going to try and make that into an animation, a cartoon, that we can take round to festivals and show people. But I do think, politically speaking, we have a real problem because people don't want to see it. They don't want to see it, they're afraid. Because once you tap into somebody's heart, they know they have to do something, so they won't look to begin with. Just don't look. So,
back in poetry, how do you discover the poetry talents from those refugees or newcomers?
Well,
through the workshops,
through the workshops. But it's a kind of slow process.
It's a slow process.
Yeah, because somebody's
How
trying
do
to
you
speak.
encourage them to write in English and to publish?
Well,
How
you
can they
just
compete with the English writers who are originally English and
because
yeah.
they have stories. So once you've got content, like bring me the stories from Syria, not necessarily the journey from Syria to the refugee camps, but tell me what life was like when you were happy. Tell me about the rest of the world. Tell me about Iraq. Tell me about how angry you are at watching your country bombed.
So there is a part of it not about poetry. So.
Well, it begins with the content. That's how it begins. And then it's my job to teach people how to write technically better. But we're starting to see some incredible writing now. For those people who've been here a couple of years, because they're coming very young, some of them, they're learning extremely quickly.
Are there any publishing houses that adopt their?
Yeah, I mean, there is Amir Dorish.
Amir Dorish.
Yeah, and he's been very successful. His book, Don't Forget the Couscous, is very popular. In London, there is a press called Outspoken Press, and their whole aim is to publish high-quality work, and it's got a real edge to the work. So it's my publishers now. I've just switched to them. And they're searching constantly for new voices. My new collection is about women's stories from across the world.
Yeah.
So from Afghanistan, from Palestine, from Wigan, from London, from Thailand, from Bali, Iraq. I tried to get into Iraq. I've been talking to people called the Amir Foundation about going in there. And I've made some connections with some Iraqis who are settled in London. But really I want to go to Palestine, Afghanistan and to Iraq. But it's very difficult to be allowed in. So my aim is to produce a collection like this. It's called Songs My Enemy Taught Me, my new one, it's not out yet. And then to give, say this much, all of this I write, and then this much I'm giving to women from Afghanistan who write landays to fill. So I'm going to give a part of my book over to other cultures.
In your opinion, what is the message of any poet?
Change.
Change.
Art is activism. Whether you choose to write about politics or flowers, you are making a strong political statement. If love was banned, then romantic poetry would be political. Yeah? So I think no matter what you do, you are a voice. Make sure you say something important.
The voice for those who don't have.
Yeah, even if your poetry is funny, even if you're a comic poet, that is making a difference. You're making people think about the world. And I think in these times it's so important that globally we make connections.
Great.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your poetry production and what are your books that you have issued, poetry collections?
Well, I've done a lot of anthologies, too many to list. And then I've got one book called Scar Tissue, as in scar music, and this one, The Woman Who Was Not There, and then my new one coming out next year, Songs My Enemy Taught Me. So those are the three ones I've written, plus a novel which is called The Woman Who Looked Through Walls, and then bigger, what I call choreo plays, so they're like poetry plays, one called Naming, one called Horror Stories, one called Lucid Johnson, Abigail's Play Party. So I've got a few of those kind of things out there, as well as some essays. But like I said, most of the work I do is live, and it kind of has... So last night, you saw me perform.
Yeah.
I was making up, on the spot, some of that poetry. Wasn't written. When I have my Kindle out, there are parts in new poems I haven't written. So I look at the audience, particularly... Everything You Have Ever Lost.
Wow, it's here.
Yeah, that one.
That's great.
So, because it's important that that you don't perform a poem twice the same way. If you've got 30 different people, or 200 or 1,000 different people, your poem needs to change to fit them.
Yeah.
This stuff is set. So I'm taught in British schools some of my poetry. I'm part of so every year I get hundreds of emails and texts from teenagers asking me the answer to questions about my poems. So those are kind of set pieces that I can't change, really, or I'll mess up the kids' heads. But new stuff, I think it's important to kind of... A poem is never finished. It's never, and certainly my only editor is the audience.
Your graphics and images in poetry never finish. You have expand
exactly
in your images and graphics, and you have different interpretation in each poem.
Exactly. So I think that's what the live arena is about. It's like when you go and see a band, you go and see a music band. If they sound exactly like their 3-minute record, what was the point of them being on stage? You want that 3-minute record expanded to 10 minutes, and then you get all the nuances and all the and the anger and the passion and feeling, all the difficult things that you can't put on a record because the majority of people would find it too overwhelming. You would go to a gig and see that happen. That's the point of a live performance. It needs to be different to the thing that you wrote.
Well, how do you identify modernity in poetry?
Modernity?
Yeah.
Oh, I think that's possibly at its heart for me. Mm-hmm. So I think form is very interesting, but I am anti-form. I'm what you call a free verse. So I would I will switch between different styles in the middle of a poem. It's almost like epic poetry has become very popular in the UK. So slam poetry said that every poem should be 3 minutes long, yeah? And we did that for a while, but then it became that we were literally writing to win slams rather than for the sake of the poem. So I broke out of it, and now I do like 4-minute pieces, 5-minute pieces, as well as some shorter ones as well. Mm-hmm. But that's become a really popular kind of form, although it's anti-form. And how would you define modernity?
It's up to the poet.
Exactly.
every poet has
a different view.
Different view, has different.
Yeah. I think what's really interesting at the moment, possibly because of our time of crisis, is that people who we call page poets, people who would normally simply write books, and then they stand on stage going blah, 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 like that, and then after a poem nobody claps, and then they do the second poem, they're just literally reading. Their standard of writing is very high, and their standard of performance is very low. In spoken word, we have very high performance, and some of the writing is much lower standard. So I think one of the ways that artists are responding to this crisis is we're looking at each other and go, I could learn from you. So as a result, in the UK, spoken word has become technically the writing much stronger, and the page poets are becoming much, much better at performing their own poems, and memorising them, looking an audience in the eye when they read, which is important because the poem's not happening in spite of the audience, it's for them. So if you ignore them, it's really arrogant. You need to, in my opinion, you need to look at the audience, say hello, be aware that some of them have paid 10 euros to come and see you, or 15 euros, and give them something they can remember. Because they can always buy your book, but this live performance is happening once only, and that's why it's cost you 15 euros. Yeah.
How that happened?
Well, the first time it happened was about 8 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, and I got an invitation from Buckingham Palace to attend a special poetry day, along with these amazing, really well-known writers like Roger McGough, John Hegley. They're kind of giants of poetry in the UK, and in fact the world. And they invited me along, to do a little performance and lead a workshop. So that was the first time, and I think I was telling someone last night what it was actually like, which was...
how did you feel, or how you felt when you got the invitation to attend that great event?
Conflicted, because I am not a royalist. I'm an anti-royalist. I'm left-wing. But on the other hand, I'm from a working class, disadvantaged background, and you're brought up to believe that the Queen is like, that means you are successful. It means you are really, really successful. So, and also very curious to go inside Buckingham Palace and to meet this woman, and just to walk around the palace itself was bizarre and really interesting. And you have to get there at 6 a.m. To go through airport security. They want to check that you've not got any recording devices or knives or bombs or drugs or anything, which I did. No, I didn't. And then I went in and I did a little performance and did a workshop. And I assumed we were all getting breakfast. But that didn't happen. What we were given was champagne. The royal family can certainly drink, I tell you. So by the time the Queen came to meet me, I was pretty drunk, to be honest. Because it was like, you know, it was 9 o'clock in the morning and all I'd had is champagne. So that was really, I was just like, oh my gosh. And then the second time was, I think, about 18 months ago, a year, 2 years ago. And they invited roughly, I think it was 100, it seemed less than that, let's say 50 of the biggest poets working in Britain at that time to come along to Buckingham Palace just to meet each other.
Yeah. But what did you perform when you were, what did you perform?
Do you know, it's really hard to remember what I did.
But what kind of have you prepared some kind of poetry that this is
I did
devoted for?
No, I did exactly what I would normally do. Exactly the same. Exactly. I probably did shorter pieces. It was like 8 years ago the first time, so I can't remember. The second time, I didn't perform. I went to talk about what I do and to make connections. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, the Queen and Prince Philip arrived. I know, and I wasn't expecting it. So, and neither was a few of the people, my friends. So Kate Tempest, I was with her, and Dreadlock Alien, and Frisco, Ali Kadima. And we were not expecting it at all. So we got really bad giggles. We were giggling. Kate hadn't even dressed up. She was wearing some tracksuit. It was really funny. And then we thought, I thought that when I took her hand, I thought I just stayed upright and said, yes, Mum. And then I moved to Prince Philip, and he's horrible. He's a horrible man. Really horrible. And I was just like, he did a thing I call bar coding, and that's when you look at someone and you go, that's what he did to me. And I was like, because if you did that to me in a bar, I would hit you. So he did that, and then I walked away. Me and Kate and Dreadlock Alien and Frisco, we all went, you know what, I didn't bow to her, I didn't bow. What we didn't know was that there was a royal photographer who was filming it, and they sent us the photographs afterwards, and every single one of us was bowing like this on the ground. So it's really, it's very interesting what myth can do to someone. Yeah, so the myth of the royal family. I mean, who are these people? Who are they? Why are they more important than some kid on the streets of Manchester? It doesn't make any sense. Why? Because their parents were murderers, so they get more? It's crazy. But when it actually came to the moment, clearly all of us went, yes, we bowed.
You are very bold.
Yes. So, I mean, that was interesting, but it's certainly not the highlight of my career. It's very... The thing about the palace, okay, is that the most interesting thing for me is that you have these huge palatial rooms, beautiful rooms. And they're not the interesting thing, it's the walls. There are rooms within the walls. So all the servants and the staff run in the walls to follow the royal family, and I guess us as well, to make sure we've got everything we need. And I know about the rooms in the walls because I'm a smoker, and I turned to one of the footmen and was just like, bruv, I need a cigarette, where can I smoke? And rather than him tell me off, he was like, come here. And he just like leant on the wall and took me inside a wall, and I was smoking inside the wall and come back out into the palace. It was amazing.
So now, Joelle, unfortunately the time is running out.
Oh,
and
okay. Thank you so much.
I have to thank you for being here.
Pleasure, absolute pleasure. Thank you, darling.
Thank you very much.
Really great to meet you.